This hour, the second day of the ANC National General Council continues in Boksburg. This is in east of Johannesburg. The ANC NGC is used as a midterm progress report on the state of the organization. Today's program will comprise of commissions which will discuss the state of the National Democratic Revolution and the balance of forces. Here's SABC News anchor Ayanda Nyati with the latest this hour. So, good day to you, Ayanda. Take us through the latest conversations to come out of there.
Well, Mkolisi, these are happening behind closed doors. We're expecting a lunchtime update from ANC officials at around 1:30 if the schedule's anything to go by. And I imagine at that stage they won't really go into the details of what they're able to agree with and what perhaps the areas of divergence are, but they'll give us a general overview of the level of participation at the very least in these breakaway sessions called the commissions. And as you mentioned, today it's about the NDR, the National Democratic Revolution, and this concept of the balance of forces. We're coming to you once again live from a very lively media center. I mean, if we can't doorstop anyone, the media journalists are all going to converge here, where I imagine copies being written and they're making sense of, at the very least, the latest briefing we got from Mahlengu Benge, the spokesperson of the ANC, who was here to give us a sense of how day one went, but really had to field questions about the ANC's funding crisis, which may very well be linked to that existential crisis we're told about. So far, our understanding is that some ANC staffers are yet to be paid. There's been a concession now from the ANC itself that this is a problem. Mahlengu Benge speaking about how the party is still transitioning from relying on donor funding, even from as far as the Netherlands, as they move from being a liberation movement to being in governance. I imagine those questions will continue to linger, but let's get an understanding at the very least of why else this conference is important. Bring in now Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya, who's with Xolelwa Scenarios and joins us now once again. And part of what I really enjoy, Xolelwa, hearing about is these scenarios that you typically build. And in terms of their relevance now, we know, of course, that part of what the ANC will be doing at this conference is positioning themselves, hopefully, to start winning elections again. Mm-hmm. The most recent election was considered a bruising one for the ANC. We've got the local government polls coming next year, and we're also looking ahead, I have no doubt, to 2029. Mm-hmm. What are your scenarios telling you about how things are likely to unfold over the next couple of years?
Okay. In terms of the next 10 years, because the new horizon for the scenarios is 2035, so the storylines that we came up with have got three key driving forces. So these are the issues that will drive us towards 2035, whatever that future is. And the first one is the sluggish economy. So, I mean, it seems like a double negative because we're talking about economic growth, but it's negative. So because it's so negative, it will inform the future of the country. And it's one of the major key drivers. The second one is that of leadership within the state. So it's about state weakness, it's about state capacity, and also declining accountability. So within the issues that you find about corruption, no consequences really from the Zondo Commission and the recapture of key state institutions. And lastly, another key driver will be that of internal security that is threatened by anger and distrust by the citizenry. So we find ourselves in a situation where there's both internal and external security threats. So you combine those and you get three different stories. And now, because leadership is one of those key drivers, we found that none of the current players in the political space will be able to win any election outright.
So coalitions are here.
So there will be coalition governments. We've already started, and 2024 was a dress rehearsal really for what will happen in 2029. So what we see there are three different types of coalition governments that could likely emerge. The first one being a continuation of what we have in the form of the GNU, where we have these different combinations of political organizations that do not necessarily agree ideologically or even positioning or ideas. but because it was convenient at the time, they had to join forces. And that is now an extreme of that. And we've called that the Hadida coalition government, which is very noisy and always bickering and pointing fingers and blaming this one and blaming the other one, blame our history, blame the whites, blame corruption, the ANC, and so on. The second coalition government that could emerge is that would emerge out of a fallout within all political parties because of this GNU formation. So there will be those that will be disgruntled and a breakaway and campaign on a promise to return to traditional values. So those different combinations, because they rise out of populist ideas, they manage to form a coalition, but soon turn against their own citizens because they become more authoritarian in their approach because they had promised that they will deal with crime, but then you find that they become more heavy-handed. And I mean, South Africa is a human rights-based country and citizens are very vocal. So then it becomes heavy-handed against its own citizens and then there's a fallout. But then the more heavy-handed they are, they start repressing freedom of speech and all these freedoms that we treasure today. But then that leads to other things where even the African continent starts questioning our elections because they doubt the credibility of the 2034 election that has secured yet another win for this authoritarian government.
Wow.
Then we have the last coalition combination that may arise if society were to get absolutely hurtful and erupt into protest mode, something that resembles the mass democratic movement of the 90s leading up to 1994, where we saw the country being rendered ungovernable. But then you've got coalitions being formed at grassroots level where you've got artists, faith-based organizations, social movements, youthful movements coming together and actually forming a political force that emerges as a leader in parliament by 2034. And because they're informed by grassroots struggles, then they start doing things differently. For example, establishing community courts, dealing with crime in a more effective manner that is all-inclusive and informs collaboration. They also manage to attract business that also has to fall in and become more activist in its approach because activism becomes the order of the day, like we become active citizens. And by 2034, that coalition manages to earn the trust of society because it's a broad-based coalition that was never part of the original political party system that we know today.
Yeah, and this is quite the forecast, right? We're looking a decade ahead, as you've just explained. And I wonder if there are any of these delegates who might be taking a break from their commissions now, listening to you and trying to figure out which of these three scenarios is the one we should aim for in a context where, let's face it, no one's going to be in charge in the way that the ANC used to be. In other words, it's 50% plus one. How does the ANC use this particular midterm review, and more specifically, I suppose, this concept of the NDR and the balance of forces, to kind of pivot to a scenario that may be favorable? And I ask this question not even knowing which one is better for the ANC, frankly, because I think, yeah, I mean, if they could, they'd have a fourth scenario where we're back to the ANC being in charge again.
It's funny because that's what they usually ask us when we have opportunities to present to either the ANC or government, because I mean, they're still a leading government. And the first question would be, is there a fourth scenario? And unfortunately, because we are researchers and this is informed by data and years and years of research. And unfortunately, these are the cards we dealt with. This is the reality of South Africa today. We made the bed and now we have to lay on it. So the ANC has to reckon with that and make choices today that favor that, or at least, if they are for the nation, to try and lead the process of steering the nation away from the Hadida or the vulture culture. Because you will recall that even the mass democratic movement idea that we emulate to write the Weaver scenarios had ANC influence in it, because the ANC was still banned at that time, and we had all these social movements in the late 80s, 90s who rose and and there was a mass movement across the country. But there was the idea that there's an ANC somewhere out there, and that's why by 1994 everyone fell in and made sure that the ANC then becomes the umbrella body that then leads us to that 1994 election. Whether it's still that ANC that we have today, that society can trust with such a thing, because I know they always say the ANC liberated the nation, but it was that movement that said we will give the ANC that mandate to actually become a representative of us all, whether we are from the churches or we are from, UDF, for example, or any other, NGO or women's group that was active at the time. They all fell under the umbrella of the ANC. Yeah. But I think society has evolved now.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a point we're told in the history books where it could have been the PAC, for example, that led society through that really seminal moment of our transition. And here we are, speaking about history and literature and all those great things. I know a question that often comes up is whether or not the delegates that are here have a grasp of these things, Are we really here to do a temperature gauge for the succession battle, which we know typically overshadows these kind of gatherings? Or are delegates really interested in the policies? And the question was asked in a different way to Xolelwa, who we know is the president of the Veterans League, who actually came out to say that part of what they're hoping would come from this gathering is teaching moments, right? Educating about what the ideas are, what the policies are, and why they're important. Are you confident, though, given your own interactions, perhaps with some people here in the past, around just the level of education and educating that takes place in conferences or councils like these?
It's interesting how sometimes you find that the people who understand the history of the ANC are people outside of the ANC who've taken the time to appreciate where the organization comes from. And I think with the organization trying to become this broad-based organization with big numbers targeted, it then attracted unfavorable characters who then rendered the ANC as an organization that had shifted in terms of its values, because a lot of people seem to have joined the ANC so that they could benefit from state machinery. And also the ANC has not taken seriously the work of political education and an understanding of the history of the ANC. I mean, for example, right now they're talking about the National Democratic Revolution, which is something that is attached to the brand of the South African Communist Party. However, with the South African Communist Party saying they're going to go to the elections on their own, there was a bit of heckling and when the SABC had a moment to speak yesterday, it was very difficult, and the chairperson had to come in to intervene. So if you're going to spend these 4 days talking about the NDR, you have to show respect to the South African Communist Party because it's their ideological contribution to this tripartite alliance. So you wonder then about the people in the room, whether they have that understanding and the appreciation of that history, why the SACP is in the alliance, what is their role and function.
Right, absolutely. And I suppose what will also be interesting is to see how they maneuver is not the right word, but try to rationalize what the SACP has said in going at this differently, right? The president of the party yesterday made concessions, I think, that this doesn't really help. This is not what they would have wanted, and they're going to have to somehow work with it. How do they negotiate this in their commissions, as they sit discussing the NDR today?
It will probably end up being the same as before, wherein the SACP says we're going at it alone, and then they come back and they're not. So we could be seeing another example of previous announcements by the SACP. So we'll have to see if they will really, or it's one of those, it's part of the tradition and culture of these gatherings of the ANC, especially before election. There's always this noise coming from the SACP. So we'll have to wait and see if that will truly happen.
Absolutely. All right, Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate it with Indlulamiti scenarios, helping us make sense, of course, of day 2 of the ANC's NGC.